Caught on tape, Prince Harry visibly livid at InvictusGame's Vancouver's InvictusGame's competitor asked, "Are you still a prince?" It was supposed to be another routine appearance for Prince Harry at the InvictusGames in Vancouver, a moment of celebration, unity, and camaraderie among wounded veterans and adaptive athletes who had overcome unimaginable hardships. But in an instant, a single question changed everything. It wasn't shouted by an angry protester or whispered in the back corners of a newsroom. It was asked directly to his face, in front of cameras, by one of the very competitors he was there to support. "Are you still a prince?" A simple question, a few short words, but the impact was seismic. It cut through the noise of PR statements, royal protocols, and well-crafted interviews. It left Prince Harry visibly stunned, his face betraying a flicker of emotion that even the most composed of public figures struggle to suppress. This was no ordinary moment. It was an unfiltered, unscripted encounter that captured a raw, undeniable truth. The very question that has haunted Prince Harry since stepping away from the royal family. What is he now? A prince by blood, yet a royal in exile, a man caught between two worlds. And more importantly, does he even know the answer himself? The incident took place at a high-energy venue filled with the unwavering spirit of the Invictus Games. Athletes who had overcome war wounds, trauma, and the odds stacked against them were here, celebrating perseverance and resilience. The last thing anyone expected was for the event's founder, the man who had built this competition into an international movement, to be forced into an existential crisis in real time. The video spread like wildfire. Within minutes, social media was ablaze with speculation, memes, and analysis. Some saw the moment as a painful reality check, a symbol of just how much Prince Harry had lost since leaving the royal fold. Others viewed it as an unnecessary jab, an attempt to humiliate a man who had long been trying to carve out his own path. But no matter which side of the debate people fell on, one thing was certain: this moment would not be forgotten. Before we get into the aftermath, reactions, and what this means for Prince Harry's future, let's take a step back. How do we get here? How did Prince Harry, once the beloved heir to the British throne, find himself in a situation where his very identity as a royal was questioned in such a direct, unrelenting way? To understand the weight of this moment, we must look beyond the headlines and sound bites. We must go back to the decisions that led him to this point, the choices that have shaped his public persona, and the challenges he continues to face in defining his place in the world. From the moment he and Meghan Markle announced their departure from royal duties in 2020, the public's perception of Prince Harry has been a tug-of-war. On one side, he is seen as a courageous individual who chose personal freedom over obligation. On the other, he is perceived as a man who walked away from duty, yet still wants to reap the benefits of his former life. The contradiction of his existence, seeking privacy while remaining in the spotlight, rejecting royal life yet keeping royal titles, has kept him at the center of endless scrutiny. The Invictus Games, however, have always been his sanctuary, a space where he wasn't just a royal, but a leader, an advocate, and a source of inspiration for injured servicemen and women. This was his arena, his home turf. And yet, in a matter of seconds, the question shattered that illusion. It was a stark reminder that no matter how far he travels, how much he builds, or how many causes he champions, the shadow of royalty still follows him. What made this moment even more striking was the setting itself. Unlike controlled interviews with friendly media outlets or staged public appearances, this was real. The question came from someone who had every right to ask it, an athlete who had served, sacrificed, and now stood before Harry as an equal. There were no filters, no PR buffers, no scripted responses. Just a man faced with the undeniable truth of his existence. Was it fair? Perhaps not. But was it inevitable? Absolutely. The question didn't come out of nowhere. It was the result of years of speculation, shifting narratives, and the ongoing battle between who Harry was born to be and who he wants to become. In that moment, as the weight of the question settled, his response, or a lack thereof, became just as important as the words themselves. Did he answer? Did he laugh it off? Did he snap back? The tension in the air was palpable, and every second that passed felt heavier than the last. Because this wasn't just about a question. It was about the fundamental struggle Prince Harry has been facing since the day he left Buckingham Palace. It was about identity, power, and the consequences of choice. And that's why this moment matters. It's more than a viral clip or a trending topic. It's a mirror into the soul of a man who has spent years trying to define himself, only to be reminded that the world may never see him as anything other than what he was born to be. So, what happened next? How did the public react? And most importantly, what does this mean for Prince Harry moving forward? We're about to dive deeper into the story, uncovering the emotions, the fallout, and the real question everyone is asking. Does Prince Harry himself know the answer? The atmosphere at the Invictus Games in Vancouver was electric. Athletes from around the world, each with their own stories of resilience and triumph, gathered to celebrate the power of the human spirit. Flags waved, cheers filled the air, and cameras flashed as the opening events got underway. This was a place of inspiration, a reminder that no obstacle was too great to overcome. Prince Harry had always been at home in this environment. From the very inception of the Invictus Games, he had positioned himself as more than just a royal figurehead. He was a brother-in-arms, a champion for wounded warriors, a man who understood, at least in part, the sacrifices these competitors had made. His dedication to the cause was undeniable, and despite the controversies surrounding his personal life, the Games had remained a space where he commanded respect. But as he entered the venue that day, there was something different in his demeanor. He carried himself with the usual confidence, but those who had followed him closely over the years might have noticed subtle changes. There was a weight on his shoulders, an unspoken tension in his expression. The cheers of the crowd were welcoming, but they were no longer as unanimous as they once were. Perhaps he knew what was coming. Perhaps he had already braced himself for the reality that, in the world he now occupied, there was no such thing as a fully friendly crowd. Every step he took, every glance he gave, was scrutinized. Gone were the days when his mere presence was enough to inspire unquestioned admiration. As he moved through the crowd, shaking hands and exchanging words with athletes and spectators, the cameras trailed him. The media had long since learned that even the smallest interaction involving Prince Harry could be spun into headlines, dissected into 1,000 narratives, debated on talk shows and social media feeds. Then, in the middle of it all, it happened. The competitor, an Invictus Games athlete whose identity would later become a topic of intense speculation, approached him. Their conversation started as any other. A handshake, a nod of respect, an exchange of words that seemed pleasant enough. But then came the question. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't delivered with malice. In fact, it was spoken in a tone that almost suggested curiosity more than anything else. But that only made it more powerful. Are you still a prince? For a fraction of a second, time seemed to stop. The question hung in the air, suspended between them. The surrounding crowd seemed to take a collective pause, waiting for the reaction that would follow. Prince Harry's face, which had been composed and engaged just moments before, flickered with something different. A micro-expression that was there and gone in an instant. His jaw tensed, his eyes darkened just slightly, his lips pressed together as if choosing whether to respond at all. For those watching closely, this was the moment that would define the entire event, because no matter how he chose to respond, the damage was already done. The question itself was the story. There were multiple ways he could have handled it. He could have laughed it off, made a light-hearted joke, brushed it aside. He could have taken a diplomatic approach, offering a carefully worded response that neither confirmed nor denied anything. He could have ignored it entirely and moved on as if he hadn't heard it. But instead, what followed was a beat of silence, a pause that stretched just long enough to make it clear that the question had landed. It had struck a nerve, and in that moment, whether intentionally or not, the competitor had accomplished something that no journalist, no commentator, no royal biographer had managed to do so directly. They had forced Prince Harry to confront, in real time, the very question that the entire world had been asking since the day he stepped away from the royal family. Was he still a prince? Technically, yes. His title, though no longer in active use, had not been formally stripped. But in every practical sense, the answer was far more complicated. He was no longer addressed as His Royal Highness. He no longer carried out royal duties. He no longer had a place within the royal institution. So what did that make him? The expression on his face revealed what words never could. The flicker of frustration, the tightening of his jaw, the way his posture subtly shifted. In that moment, he wasn't Prince Harry, the Duke of Sussex, the former working royal, the son of King Charles. He was a man caught in between two realities, a man forced to acknowledge the question that had haunted him since the day he left. The cameras caught it all. The competitors around them noticed. The audience, both in person and watching from afar, felt the tension. And then, just as quickly as it had happened, the moment passed. He composed himself. He gave a brief response, one that would later be dissected endlessly by analysts and royal watchers. But no words could erase what had already been seen, because the question had already been asked, the doubt had already been planted, and in the world of public perception, hesitation speaks louder than any carefully crafted statement ever could. What happened next was inevitable. The video spread like wildfire. Social media lit up with debates and speculation. News outlets scrambled to analyze every second of footage. The headlines wrote themselves. Prince Harry caught off guard. Prince Harry rattled by unexpected question. Prince Harry struggles to define his royal status. Some defended him, arguing that the question was unfair, that it was an attempt to bait him into an uncomfortable situation. Others saw it as justified, saying that it was a question he should have been prepared to answer long ago. And in the middle of it all, Prince Harry himself was left with no choice but to navigate the fallout. The Invictus Games were meant to be his sanctuary, a space where he could exist outside the shadow of his past. But now, even here, he had been forced to confront the reality that no matter where he went, no matter how much he tried to redefine himself, the world would never stop asking, was he still a prince? The energy in the venue shifted almost instantly. It was as if the entire arena, filled with thousands of spectators, competitors, and cameras, had collectively sensed the shift in the air. A moment that was supposed to be about camaraderie and triumph had suddenly taken on an entirely different tone. Prince Harry's facial expression had already given the world what it needed. He didn't need to say anything more. The cameras had captured the flicker of emotion, one that could be interpreted in a dozen different ways depending on who was watching. Some saw it as irritation, an unmistakable sign of frustration at being put on the spot with a question he likely never expected to hear in such a setting. Others saw it as a flash of vulnerability, the unguarded moment of a man who had spent years trying to outrun the weight of his title, only to be pulled right back into it in the most public of ways. And then there were those who saw something else entirely, regret. Regardless of interpretation, the fallout from the moment began almost immediately. The competitors who had been standing nearby were the first to react, some exchanging glances, others visibly unsure of what to do. Was this an awkward misstep that would be brushed aside, or had they just witnessed something more significant? In the audience, spectators who had been cheering and clapping just moments before suddenly quieted. Some murmured amongst themselves, their heads turning toward the big screens replaying the interaction. Others kept their eyes locked on Prince Harry, waiting to see what he would do next. Even the event organizers, standing at a distance, seemed momentarily frozen, uncertain whether to intervene, change the subject, or simply let the moment play itself out. But perhaps the most telling reaction came from the cameras themselves. The journalists and photographers who had been covering the Invictus Games had already been prepared to capture engaging visuals of Prince Harry interacting with athletes, congratulating winners, and delivering motivational speeches. But now, they had something far more valuable, a moment of unfiltered, unscripted drama, and they weren't about to miss it. Camera lenses zoomed in, microphones angled toward him. Social media correspondents rushed to upload clips in real time. The moment was already being dissected and analyzed before it had even fully played out. The weight of the moment was not lost on Prince Harry. He had spent years dealing with the press, understanding how quickly narratives could spiral out of control. He knew, without a doubt, that this single question would dominate headlines in a matter of hours, which meant he had only one option: to regain control of the situation before it slipped away entirely. His response, measured, brief, and calculated, was an attempt to do just that. But no matter what he said, it was already too late, because the real story was no longer about his words. It was about the hesitation, the pause, the involuntary reaction that no amount of media training could erase. It was about what wasn't said just as much as what was. As he moved on from the encounter, shaking more hands, smiling for more cameras, and continuing through the event, the moment lingered in the air. And outside the venue, far beyond the walls of the Invictus Games, the real storm was about to begin. Within minutes, clips of the interaction began appearing on social media. The question, just 5 words long, became an instant trending topic. Are you still a prince? Users on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok rushed to give their takes. Some called it a defining moment in Prince Harry's post-royal journey, the moment where he was forced to confront the reality of his own choices. Others saw it as an unnecessary provocation, an attempt to humiliate him in a space that was supposed to be about celebrating veterans. The debates intensified with every passing hour. Some people pointed out that it was a fair question. After all, had Harry himself not spent the last few years blurring the lines between his royal status and his new life? He had walked away from official duties, distanced himself from the monarchy, and even publicly criticized the institution. Yet he still retained the title of Duke of Sussex, still used his royal connections for influence, still appeared at events where his royal past was an unspoken backdrop. So, was it truly unfair for someone to ask him directly, to demand clarity on something that had remained deliberately vague? Others, however, saw the moment as an ambush. Prince Harry had come to the Invictus Games to support veterans, not to defend his royal identity. The competitor who asked the question, some argued, had overstepped, bringing unnecessary personal drama into a space that was supposed to be about unity and resilience. It didn't take long before media outlets picked up the story, each spinning it in their own way. British tabloids, long critical of Harry since his departure from the royal family, framed the moment as an embarrassing reminder of how far he had fallen. Some headlines suggested that the question had shaken him, that it had exposed the internal struggle he had tried so hard to mask. Pro-Harry publications, on the other hand, painted the moment as an unfair attack, an example of how no matter what he did, he would always be held to impossible standards. Meanwhile, royal commentators and experts wasted no time weighing in. Body language analysts were invited onto talk shows to dissect Harry's reaction. Some argued that his pause was a sign of deep-seated uncertainty, a subconscious admission that even he wasn't sure where he stood anymore. Others dismissed it as a momentary lapse, something that had been blown out of proportion. And then there was Buckingham Palace. While no official response was issued from the royal family, sources close to the monarchy quietly let it be known that the moment had not gone unnoticed. Behind palace doors, whispers of how this could impact Harry's already fragile relationship with his father and brother began to circulate. Some speculated that the moment could accelerate the process of stripping him of his remaining titles, something that had been rumored for years but had never fully materialized. Others suggested that it could push Harry further away from any chance of reconciliation with the family he had left behind. Whatever the case, the fallout from the question was far from over. For Prince Harry, the next few days would be crucial. How he handled the situation, what he said in response, and whether he chose to address the question head-on or let the media storm run its course would all play a role in shaping the narrative. But no matter what he did next, one thing was certain. The question had been asked. And once a question like that is out in the open, it can never truly be taken back. For days after the moment was caught on tape, the ripple effects continued to spread. What had initially been an unexpected exchange at the Invictus Games had now escalated into a full-blown media frenzy. Everywhere, the same question was being asked, debated, analyzed. Are you still a prince? Social media had already ensured that the video reached audiences far and wide. Major news networks ran segments replaying the moment in slow motion, pausing on Prince Harry's reaction, dissecting the expressions on his face as if they were reading into the pages of a novel. Headlines were crafted with precision to elicit engagement. Some took a sympathetic approach, emphasizing how difficult it must have been for him to be put on the spot like that. Others framed it as the moment his carefully crafted post-royal life was shattered by an unavoidable truth. But beyond the media firestorm, there was a more pressing issue. The conversation happening among the very people who had gathered at the Invictus Games. The competitors, many of whom had deep respect for Prince Harry and his work in creating the event, were now discussing something they had perhaps never openly acknowledged before. Had he changed? Those who had met him before, at previous games or military events, recalled a man who had once seemed completely at ease in their company. A prince, yes, but one who carried himself as a soldier first. Someone who spoke their language, shared their struggles, and, despite the privileges of his birth, had earned their respect. But now, there was hesitation. Some felt he had drifted too far from that world, that his life in California, his high-profile media ventures, and his increasingly public grievances with the royal family had created a distance, one that could not be bridged with just a handshake and a smile. It was a sentiment not spoken loudly, but it was there, lingering in the air like an unspoken truth. The Invictus Games were his creation, his legacy. But was he still the man they had once rallied behind? Meanwhile, in royal circles, the discussion was taking on a different tone. For King Charles and Prince William, the headlines about Harry's encounter at the Invictus Games were both predictable and frustrating. The palace had long since adopted a policy of silence when it came to Harry's public missteps, refusing to engage in what they viewed as unnecessary media spectacle. But behind the scenes, there was growing concern. For years, Harry had managed to maintain his connection to the royal family through his Duke of Sussex title, his patronages, and his continued association with projects like the Invictus Games. But this moment had reignited discussions about whether it was time to formally sever those ties. After all, the question asked at the Games was not just about Harry's identity. It was about the public's perception of his status. Could a man who had stepped away from royal duties, who had repeatedly criticized the institution, who had built a new life on an entirely different continent, still be considered a prince in the eyes of the world? More importantly, should he? There was no easy answer. For Harry himself, the situation was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. In the days following the Games, he had largely remained silent, choosing not to comment on the viral moment or address the speculation surrounding it. But as the media attention refused to die down, pressure mounted for him to say something, anything, that could either confirm or deny the world's assumptions. His team debated internally. Some advised him to ignore it entirely, to let the moment fade from public discussion as new headlines took over. Others saw it as an opportunity, perhaps a chance to clarify, once and for all, where he stood and what his role truly was. But the real question was whether Harry himself knew the answer. Because beyond the media narratives, beyond the public reactions, beyond the debates on social media, there was one inescapable reality. This moment had touched on something far deeper than just a title. It had forced Harry to confront a truth that he had spent years trying to navigate. He had left the royal family, but the royal family had never truly left him. He had shed the responsibilities of a working royal, but he had never entirely relinquished the identity that came with it. And now, with one question, the world had made it clear. They saw the contradiction, and they weren't going to ignore it any longer. It was a turning point, one that demanded a response, and whether he liked it or not, Prince Harry would have to face it. As the days passed, the media cycle refused to let go of the story. What had begun as a fleeting moment in a crowded venue had now evolved into a defining event, sparking renewed discussions about Prince Harry's identity, his choices, and his place in the world. The headlines remained relentless, each one more provocative than the last. Harry humiliated on camera, Prince without a kingdom. How long can he keep up the act? The question that shattered Prince Harry's image in seconds. Every news outlet found its own way to capitalize on the moment, drawing in audiences eager for updates. Royal commentators were in high demand, their analysis dissecting not just the words exchanged but the deeper implications. Theories emerged, speculation ran wild, and the debate raged on. But beyond the media noise, another conversation was unfolding in private, one that carried far more weight. The royal family had not issued an official response, as was expected. For years, their approach to Harry's actions had been to remain silent, to avoid adding fuel to the fire. But internally, the palace was watching closely. King Charles, despite his personal affection for his son, had long been advised to take a firmer stance. The monarchy relied on stability, on maintaining the structure and hierarchy that had defined it for centuries. The lingering connection to Harry, with all the controversy and unpredictability that came with him, was increasingly seen as a liability. Prince William, on the other hand, was less conflicted. He had spent years shouldering the responsibility of the future crown, navigating the pressures of his role while also managing the fallout from his brother's decisions. To him, the moment at the Invictus Games was just another example of why Harry's ties to royalty needed to be fully severed. He was no longer one of them. And if the public was now openly questioning Harry's status, wasn't it time for the institution itself to do the same? Behind the walls of Buckingham Palace, quiet discussions resumed over whether action should be taken. Stripping him of his titles had always been an option, one that had been considered multiple times but never pursued. The official reason was that it would only add more drama, giving Harry and Meghan another reason to claim victimhood and fueling their narrative of exile. But now, in the wake of this very public moment, the question was being asked again. Would it be more damaging to allow this contradiction to continue? The situation was complicated by the fact that Harry himself had never formally renounced his titles. While he had agreed not to use his Royal Highness after stepping back, he remained the Duke of Sussex. And despite his vocal criticism of the institution, he had never gone so far as to reject his royal identity outright. But this incident at the Invictus Games had laid bare a truth that could no longer be ignored. He could not exist in both worlds indefinitely. For Harry, the realization was sinking in as well. In California, where he had built his new life, he had carved out an existence far removed from the rigid expectations of royalty. His mansion in Montecito, his celebrity friends, his Netflix and Spotify deals. These were the markers of his new identity. He had spoken openly about his struggles within the royal system, about the need for autonomy, about his desire to protect his family from the pressures of palace life. And yet, the moment a single competitor had asked the question, he had not been able to answer it with certainty. That hesitation spoke volumes. Because the truth was, no matter how much he tried to redefine himself, he had never fully let go of what he had been born into. His book, his interviews, his documentaries, all of them revolved around his royal story. The very platform he stood on, the influence he wielded, the public's continued fascination with him. It all stemmed from the fact that he was, and would always be, Prince Harry. The world had noticed. The Invictus Games had long been a place where he had managed to separate himself from the royal spectacle. Here, he was not defined by his family name, but by his mission to support veterans and wounded warriors. But now, even in this space, the question had caught up with him. It had exposed the contradiction, forced it into the light, and left him with no choice but to confront it. Because whether he admitted it or not, the world was demanding an answer. Was he still a prince? And if so, what did that even mean? As the dust settled from the viral moment at the Invictus Games, the fallout was no longer just a media storm. It was a reality that Prince Harry himself had to face. The question that had lingered in the background of his life since leaving the royal family had now been spoken out loud, in public, in front of cameras. And no matter how much he may have wanted to move on, the world wasn't letting it go. In the days following the incident, Harry maintained his public composure. He continued appearing at the games, interacting with athletes, and delivering speeches that carried the same passion and commitment he had always brought to the event. But those who observed closely noticed subtle changes. His usual ease with the competitors, the warmth in his interactions, seemed ever so slightly restrained. He still smiled, still laughed, still engaged. But there were moments where he appeared distracted, where his mind seemed elsewhere. The weight of the moment had not left him. Behind closed doors, his team was working frantically. The discussion was no longer just about damage control. It was about defining his identity once and for all. Would he ignore the speculation and hope it faded with time? Would he directly address the question, offering a firm stance on where he stood? Or would he attempt to reshape the narrative entirely, turning this moment into an opportunity to solidify his post-royal image? The problem was, no answer would satisfy everyone. If he publicly declared that he no longer considered himself a prince, it would raise an entirely new set of questions. Why, then, had he continued using the title Duke of Sussex? Why had he maintained any royal connections at all? And would this declaration bring him closer to, or further from, his strained relationship with his family? If he claimed that he was still a prince, still part of the royal legacy, it would only fuel the criticism that had followed him since leaving. How could he continue to carry that identity while simultaneously rejecting the very institution it came from? How could he criticize the monarchy in interviews, yet still benefit from its prestige? The contradiction had existed for years, but this moment had forced him to face it directly. And as his team debated strategies, Harry himself wrestled with something deeper, the personal cost of it all. For years, his departure from the royal family had been framed as an act of liberation. He had spoken about the relief of stepping away from the pressures of palace life, the joy of being able to raise his children away from the suffocating scrutiny that had defined his own upbringing. He had built a new life in California, one filled with opportunities he never would have had within the confines of the royal institution. But in moments like this, the illusion of total freedom cracked, because despite everything, he was still bound to the identity he had tried to leave behind. No amount of distance, no number of interviews, no rebranding efforts could erase the reality of his birthright. He would always be Prince Harry in the eyes of the world, whether he wanted to be or not. And now, more than ever, the world was demanding that he choose. Meanwhile, in Britain, the conversation had taken on a life of its own. For years, the public had watched Harry's journey unfold, from the moment he and Meghan announced their decision to step back, to their explosive interviews, to their various business ventures and personal revelations. To some, he had been a hero, an outsider who had broken free from the rigid expectations of the monarchy. To others, he was a contradiction. Someone who had left but never fully let go. Someone who wanted to redefine his own role but had never fully committed to stepping away. And now, in the wake of this moment, public opinion was shifting once again. Polls were conducted, talk shows dedicated entire segments to the debate, and columnists wrote opinion pieces dissecting what this meant for Harry's long-term future. One question, spoken at an unexpected moment, had reignited the very conversation he had spent years trying to escape. Would he ever truly be free of his royal past? Did he even want to be? And if not, how much longer could he live in this limbo before a definitive choice was made for him? The reverberations of that single question, "Are you still a prince?" extended far beyond the InvictusGames arena. It was no longer just a moment caught on tape. It was a moment that had cracked open a much deeper conversation, one that had been bubbling beneath the surface for years, but had never been addressed so directly. Social media continued to buzz with opinions, but now, the narrative was evolving. What had started as an unexpected exchange had morphed into something bigger, a reflection of the growing divide between Prince Harry's self-perception and how the world saw him. News outlets carried fresh angles on the story each day, with royal experts and commentators weighing in on every possible interpretation of the incident. Some took a more sympathetic approach, arguing that Harry had been unfairly put on the spot in what was supposed to be a safe space for veterans. Others claimed that the question had merely vocalized what many had been thinking, but had never dared to ask him outright. But as the days stretched on, another question emerged, one that Harry himself could no longer ignore. Would this moment be the catalyst for a larger shift in how he defined himself? For years, Harry's identity had been split between the life he was born into and the life he had chosen for himself. He had left behind the rigid duties of royal service, yet he had kept his titles. He had distanced himself from the institution, yet he had never formally renounced his place within it. He had repeatedly emphasized his desire to carve out his own path, yet every major endeavor he had undertaken since leaving had been directly tied to his royal past. The memoir, the Netflix series, the interviews, they were all rooted in his history as a prince. Even his philanthropic work, including the InvictusGames, carried the unmistakable imprint of his royal origins. And now, with a single question, that contradiction had been laid bare for the world to see. It wasn't just about whether Harry was still a prince in name. It was about whether he was ready to truly let go of that part of himself. Behind the scenes, those closest to him were divided. Some believed this was an opportunity for him to finally take control of his own narrative. If he wanted to be seen as independent from the monarchy, now was the time to make a definitive statement. He could release a carefully crafted message affirming that while he would always be a part of the royal family by blood, His role as a prince was no longer something he wished to claim. Others cautioned against such a move. The reality was that no matter how much Harry tried to redefine himself, his connection to royalty was what kept him relevant on the global stage. The moment he fully distanced himself from that identity, he risked losing a significant part of the influence he still carried. And then there was the most difficult factor of all, his family. Though relations had been strained for years, cutting the last remaining ties would all but ensure there was no path back. It was one thing for the palace to distance itself from Harry, to remove his honorary titles, to limit his access to royal events. But for Harry himself to openly declare that he was no longer a prince, that would be an entirely different kind of separation. It would send a message not just to the public, but to his father, to his brother, to the entire monarchy. A message that could not be undone. While Harry weighed his options, the public continued to react in real time. Polls in the UK showed a divided opinion. Some believed it was time for the monarchy to take a firm stance and remove Harry's remaining titles, while others felt that despite everything, he still deserved to keep his place in the royal family. Across the Atlantic, reactions were different. Many of his supporters in the US viewed the entire incident as yet another example of the scrutiny he had been subjected to, an unnecessary attempt to put him in an uncomfortable position. To them, the question wasn't whether he was still a prince, it was whether it even mattered. But the truth was, it did matter. It mattered because, despite his best efforts, Harry's identity was still tied to the very thing he had tried to move beyond. It mattered because the world still saw him as a prince, regardless of how much he wanted to reshape his image. And it mattered because, after years of trying to walk the line between two worlds, the time for a final decision was fast approaching. The question that had once seemed so simple, just 5 words spoken in the midst of a crowded event, had now become something much bigger. A question that, for the first time, Prince Harry could no longer avoid. For Prince Harry, the aftermath of the Invictus Games incident was not just about public perception. It was about reckoning with a personal reality he had long avoided. The world had never stopped seeing him as a prince, no matter how much distance he tried to put between himself and the monarchy. And now, with one question uttered in front of a live audience, that reality had caught up to him in a way he could no longer ignore. In Montecito, where he had built his new life with Meghan Markle and their 2 children, the contrast between past and present felt sharper than ever. Here, he was no longer bound by palace protocol, no longer under the direct gaze of the British press every time he stepped outside. He could wake up in his own home, raise his children away from the rigid expectations of royal life, and shape his future in a way he never could before. Yet, the shadow of his royal past remained. Despite every effort to redefine himself, every project he had undertaken, whether it was his memoir, his Netflix series, or his advocacy work, had always been tied to his identity as a prince. His name carried weight because of where he came from, and the world's interest in him stemmed not just from his work, but from the legacy he had inherited. And that begged the question, could he ever truly separate himself from it? As Harry reflected on the fallout from the viral moment, he found himself faced with difficult choices. The question had been asked, and now, the world was waiting for an answer. But before he could decide how to respond publicly, he had to confront what the question truly meant for him on a personal level. There was no doubt that the issue of his royal identity had long been a source of conflict in his life. Even as a child, he had struggled with the rigid expectations placed upon him. Unlike his brother, Prince William, who had always been destined for the throne, Harry had occupied an uncertain space within the monarchy. He had been the spare, the backup to the heir, an identity that had followed him well into adulthood. At times, that status had afforded him freedoms his brother never had. He had served in the military, experiencing a sense of purpose and belonging that royal life could never provide. He had carved out his own path, engaging in humanitarian work and causes that genuinely mattered to him. But there had also been an undeniable burden, one that had only grown heavier as he aged. His relationship with the monarchy had always been complicated, but it was his marriage to Meghan Markle that had brought those tensions to the forefront in a way that could never be undone. The couple's departure from royal duties had been framed as an escape, a necessary step toward the life they wanted to build. But even after stepping away, The question of identity had never been fully resolved. Did leaving the institution mean he was no longer a prince in any meaningful sense? Or was his title something inescapable, woven into the fabric of who he was? For years, he had attempted to exist in the in-between, neither fully a working royal nor fully detached from his heritage. He had held on to his titles while advocating for a life outside the palace. He had distanced himself from the monarchy but continued to use the platform it had given him. And now, he was being forced to reckon with the contradictions of that choice. The discussions within his team reflected this same dilemma. His advisors knew that whatever he said next could have lasting consequences. If he remained silent, it would only fuel speculation. If he attempted to downplay the moment, it might come across as avoidance. And if he openly addressed the question, he risked setting off an entirely new wave of scrutiny. There was also the question of how this would affect his standing with the royal family. Though relations had been strained for years, his ties to the monarchy had never been fully severed. His father, King Charles, had made it clear that despite their differences, he still saw Harry as his son. His brother, Prince William, had maintained a more distant stance, but there had always been the possibility, however slim, of reconciliation. But if Harry chose to publicly distance himself from his royal identity, would that door finally close for good? Meanwhile, within the royal family itself, the incident at the Invictus Games had not gone unnoticed. King Charles, ever the pragmatist, saw the situation for what it was. A media-driven controversy that would eventually fade, as all stories did. But advisors within the palace were less certain. They argued that the moment had exposed an ongoing issue that needed to be addressed. For years, the monarchy had been content to let Harry exist in a gray area. No longer a working royal, but still retaining his titles. But was that sustainable in the long run? Or had the time come to make a definitive decision about his place within the institution? Some within the palace pushed for a final severance. They believed that the longer Harry remained in this ambiguous position, the more damage it could do to the monarchy's image. Stripping him of his remaining titles, they argued, would remove any lingering confusion about his status and allow the royal family to move forward without the constant shadow of controversy. Others were more hesitant. Despite everything, Harry remained a member of the family. Stripping him of his titles would be seen as an extreme move, one that could further fracture the already delicate relationship between him and the crown. And then there was the matter of public opinion. While many in Britain had grown increasingly critical of Harry, there were still those who believed he had been treated unfairly. Taking away his titles could be seen as an act of retribution rather than necessity, further fueling the narrative that he had been cast aside. But regardless of what the palace decided, one thing was clear. This moment had forced a conversation that could no longer be ignored. And for Harry, the choice was just as difficult. If he publicly embraced his status as a prince, he would have to reckon with what that meant for his new life in America. Could he truly claim to have left the monarchy behind, if he still carried the title that defined him? If he rejected the title, he would be making a statement that could change his public identity forever. No longer Prince Harry, Duke of Sussex, just Harry. A man who had walked away not only from his royal duties, but from his royal past. And if he did that, would he finally feel free? Or would it only make the question that had followed him all his life even more complicated? The world was watching, and soon, Harry would have to answer. As the days turned into weeks, the question that had ignited the latest royal firestorm refused to fade. Instead, it evolved, twisting into a debate that extended beyond Prince Harry himself. It was no longer just about whether he was still a prince. It had become a question of what it meant to be royal in the modern world. What was a title without duty, without responsibility, without a kingdom? The discussion played out across media platforms, from major news networks to social media comment sections. Royal historians weighed in, tracing back precedents of royals who had walked away from their positions, from King Edward VIII to Princess Diana. But none of those cases were quite like Harry's. Edward had abdicated for love, giving up the throne in exchange for a life of exile. Diana, after her divorce from Charles, had lost the title of Her Royal Highness, but remained the people's princess in the hearts of millions. Harry's situation was different. He had chosen to step away, but had never fully let go. He wanted to be separate, yet still tethered. And that was why the question had struck such a nerve. It had exposed that duality in real time, in front of the entire world. The British press continued to capitalize on the moment. The tabloids, which had long been critical of Harry's choices, used the incident to reinforce their narrative that he had become lost in his post-royal existence. Some even suggested that this was the moment the monarchy should make a decisive move, formally stripping him of all remaining titles, and finally closing the chapter on his royal status. But even as these conversations raged, something else was happening, something that few could have predicted. The question had forced not only the media and the monarchy to reassess Harry's role, but it had also forced the public to confront their own perceptions of him. Was Harry still a prince in their eyes? And if not, what was he now? Supporters in the United States, where he and Meghan had rebuilt their lives, took a much different stance than the British press. In America, the title of prince was more of a symbol than a function of government. To many of his admirers, Harry was not defined by his ties to the monarchy, but by his actions, his philanthropy, his military service, his willingness to speak openly about personal struggles. But even among his American supporters, the viral moment raised questions. If he was no longer part of the royal family's working structure, what did his title truly represent? Was it a birthright? A brand? A reminder of what he had left behind? And for those who had once admired his defiance in stepping away from royal life, a new sentiment was emerging. One of frustration. If Harry truly wanted to forge a new path, why hadn't he fully let go? Why was he still allowing himself to be caught in these cycles of public scrutiny? And most importantly, why did he still hesitate when asked such a fundamental question? Meanwhile, inside Buckingham Palace, the debate over Harry's titles was intensifying. King Charles had long been hesitant to take direct action against his son, preferring to let time and circumstance dictate the course of their relationship. But now, with the media frenzy refusing to die down, pressure was mounting. Advisors were urging him to make a decision, one that would either solidify Harry's detachment from the monarchy or reaffirm his status in a way that left no room for ambiguity. Some within the palace pushed for a firm stance. If Harry was no longer performing royal duties, then why should he continue to hold a title that suggested otherwise? Removing his Duke of Sussex title would send a clear message, one that would clarify his position and protect the monarchy from further reputational damage. Others, however, urged caution. Stripping him of his title would be seen as an aggressive move, one that could be used to further fuel the Sussexes' narrative of mistreatment. It would also be an unprecedented step. No other modern royal had been formally stripped of a ducal title in this manner. The decision was not an easy one. For Charles, there was also the personal aspect to consider. Despite their differences, this was his son. To publicly sever one of the last remaining ties between them would be an irreversible step. It could also push Harry even further away, making any future reconciliation nearly impossible. On the other hand, if Charles did nothing, the monarchy would continue to face these moments of public uncertainty. And as William prepared for his eventual ascension, the issue of Harry's lingering connection to the institution would only become more complicated. As these internal discussions continued, Harry himself was still grappling with the reality of what had happened. The moment at the Invictus Games had forced him into a corner, making him confront the fact that he had spent years living in between two worlds. And now, it seemed the world was demanding he make a choice. But what was that choice? Could he continue as he had, balancing his royal past with his new life in America, or was the moment finally approaching when he would have to step forward and declare, once and for all, that he was no longer a prince? The weight of the decision was heavier than ever. As the controversy refused to fade, Prince Harry found himself at a crossroads. The viral moment at the Invictus Games had not only reignited questions about his identity, but it had also forced the world to recognize the contradictions in his public image. He had spent years walking a fine line between royalty and independence, and now, that line had all but disappeared. The debate had grown beyond the tabloids and social media. It was now dominating serious discussions in political and academic circles, with experts weighing in on what his role truly meant in a modern world. Some viewed him as a symbol of change, a man who had rejected an archaic institution in pursuit of a life of purpose. Others saw him as an opportunist, someone who had abandoned royal duty, but still benefited from the prestige his title afforded him. And then there were those who saw the moment as a test, one that Harry had seemingly failed. Public perception, though never static, had undergone a shift. In the days following the incident, many who had once championed Harry's decision to leave the monarchy began to express frustration. The admiration that had fueled his popularity post-royal exit was now giving way to impatience. Had he truly left the monarchy behind? Or had he simply traded one form of public scrutiny for another? The answer to that question was growing more urgent by the day. Inside Buckingham Palace, discussions continued behind closed doors. Though King Charles had avoided taking decisive action in the past, the current situation was becoming increasingly untenable. The monarchy was an institution that thrived on order, tradition, and clear definitions. And yet, Harry's presence, both inside and outside of the royal narrative, had become a persistent gray area. The idea of stripping him of his titles was no longer just a suggestion. It was a real possibility. For years, the palace had avoided this step, fearing that it would create more division within the family and further alienate Harry. But now, the argument was shifting. If Harry no longer considered himself a prince, why should the royal family continue to uphold that title? It was a question that divided even those closest to the king. Some argued that stripping his titles would be seen as an act of cruelty, one that would damage the monarchy's image in the eyes of the public. Others believed that failing to act would only allow the confusion surrounding Harry's status to continue indefinitely. Meanwhile, Harry himself remained silent. In Montecito, the weight of the decision was pressing down on him. For years, he had relied on his royal background as both a burden and a tool. It had given him purpose, shaped his identity, and allowed him to champion causes he truly believed in. But now, that identity had become a question mark. Would he let go of it completely? And if he did, what would be left? His advisors were divided on how he should respond. Some urged him to take control of the narrative, to issue a statement making it clear where he stood. Others believed that saying nothing was the best course of action, allowing the moment to fade naturally over time. But deep down, Harry knew that silence could only last so long. The world was watching, the palace was waiting, and soon, a decision would have to be made. As the tension surrounding the question of Prince Harry's status grew, the world waited for some kind of resolution. The longer he remained silent, the more speculation mounted. Was he avoiding the topic? Was he internally debating his next move? Or was he simply hoping that the controversy would fade on its own? If history had proven anything, it was that stories involving the royal family never truly disappeared. They might momentarily slip from the headlines, but they always found their way back into the public discourse, especially when unresolved questions remained. Harry's reluctance to address the issue directly was not without reason. He had spent years trying to redefine himself on his own terms, away from the monarchy's influence. He had built a new life, one that prioritized his family, his mental health, and his philanthropic efforts. But despite all his efforts, he had never fully escaped the orbit of the institution he had left behind. And now, with the world demanding an answer, he faced an impossible choice. If he confirmed that he still considered himself a prince, it would be seen as a contradiction to everything he had worked towards since stepping away from royal duties. Critics would say that he wanted the prestige without the responsibility, that he was clinging to the title while rejecting the institution. It would only fuel accusations that he had never truly left. On the other hand, if he openly declared that he no longer identified as a prince, it would be a definitive severance. One that might be welcomed by his detractors, but also one that could change his public identity forever. No longer Prince Harry, no longer the Duke of Sussex, just Harry. A man without a title, without a royal connection, without the weight of history attached to his name. Was he ready for that? In the days following the viral moment, Harry kept a low profile. His appearances at the Invictus Games continued, but the once light-hearted interactions with competitors seemed more measured. There was no escaping the fact that the moment had changed the atmosphere. His team closely monitored public reaction, tracking how different media outlets and audiences were responding. While his core supporters remained loyal, there was no denying that the incident had created a fracture. Even within the world of celebrity, where Harry and Meghan had established themselves as global figures, questions were being raised. Some of their Hollywood allies had started to distance themselves, wary of becoming entangled in ongoing royal controversies. Their media deals, once celebrated as groundbreaking, were now being scrutinized for signs of struggle. Harry was no longer just facing a question about his title. He was facing the reality of what his post-royal existence truly meant. Meanwhile, within the royal family, discussions continued over how to handle the situation. While King Charles had always been cautious when it came to publicly addressing matters involving Harry, there was a growing consensus within the palace that action needed to be taken. The monarchy could not afford to have an undefined figure lingering in the public sphere, half in and half out of royal life. The question of whether to strip Harry of his remaining titles was no longer a matter of if, it was a matter of when. But the palace also knew that making such a move would have consequences. Stripping him of his titles would be seen as the final act of separation, the moment when Harry was officially removed from the royal fold. It could further damage an already fractured relationship between him and the family, making any future reconciliation even more unlikely. Yet, there were also those within the palace who believed that failing to act would be even worse. As long as Harry retained his title, the confusion surrounding his status would persist. The public would continue to question his role, and the monarchy would continue to be associated with his controversies. Some argued that allowing him to keep his title was more damaging to the institution than removing it. And so, the decision loomed. Would King Charles make the unprecedented move of formally severing Harry's last remaining tie to the royal family, or would he allow the ambiguity to continue, risking further tension and uncertainty? For Harry, the choice was no less daunting. The question had been asked. The world was waiting for an answer. And soon, whether by his own decision or by the will of the monarchy, that answer would come. The days following the viral moment at the Invictus Games only intensified the uncertainties surrounding Prince Harry's position. Every article, every talk show, every online debate circled back to the same unresolved question. Was he still a prince, and if so, for how much longer? For Harry, the weight of that question was no longer just a public spectacle. It was a deeply personal reckoning. The choices he had made over the years, from leaving the UK to launching a media empire based on his experiences, had all been steps toward carving out an independent identity. But now, he had to face the truth. No matter how far he tried to move, the world would never stop seeing him as the prince who walked away. The expectations, the scrutiny, the debates, it would all continue for as long as he existed in the in-between. If he wanted to escape the cycle, there were only two ways forward. Either he would have to reclaim his identity as a prince, fully and without contradiction, or he would have to walk away from it completely. In private, discussions among his inner circle became more urgent. His advisors, already split on how to handle the fallout, now faced the reality that Harry had to make a choice, one that would define his future. Some pushed for a clear, public statement. They believed that if Harry directly addressed the moment, he could control the narrative and turn it into a demonstration of strength. Instead of shying away, he could clarify his stance once and for all, either by reaffirming his status as a prince on his own terms, or by declaring that he no longer wished to be associated with his title. Others urged him to remain silent, to let the news cycle move on. Their argument was simple. If he gave an answer now, it would only invite more scrutiny. Any statement, no matter how carefully crafted, would be dissected endlessly, used as further fuel for the never-ending royal. For King Charles, the situation had become a delicate balance of personal and institutional responsibility. He was not just a father dealing with a son who had distanced himself from the family. He was the head of the monarchy, tasked with preserving its stability. And the longer Harry remained in this limbo, the more it became a problem. Though Charles had so far avoided taking direct action, his advisors were becoming increasingly vocal about the need for resolution. The argument was clear. If Harry was no longer part of the working royal family, then his titles only served as a source of confusion and controversy. While some in the palace urged patience, others argued that failing to act now would only allow further complications to arise in the future. But there was one key issue at the heart of it all. Would removing Harry's titles bring closure, or would it only create a new wave of resentment and backlash? For many, The idea of formally stripping Harry of his titles was seen as an irreversible step. While he had already lost his HRH status, taking away the Duke of Sussex title would be unprecedented. It would not just be a legal decision, it would be a symbolic one. A message that Harry was no longer considered a part of the royal institution in any meaningful way. And if that happened, what would it mean for Harry himself? Would it free him? Or would it only deepen the divide between him and his family, making reconciliation impossible? As the days went on, pressure from the media did not relent. Public opinion polls revealed a stark divide. While many in the UK believed Harry should be stripped of his titles, others felt that doing so would be a petty act of retaliation. In the US, the reaction was more mixed. Some saw the controversy as further proof that Harry was still trapped by the monarchy, while others viewed it as a manufactured distraction from more important issues. But regardless of where people stood, one thing was undeniable. The moment at the Invictus Games had set something into motion that could not be undone. For Harry, the time to decide was approaching. Would he hold on to his title, knowing that doing so meant continuing to exist under the shadow of his past? Or would he finally break free, accepting that in order to truly be independent, he had to let go of everything that came with being a prince? The answer was coming, and when it did, it would change everything. In the quiet corridors of Buckingham Palace, where history had been written for centuries, a decision loomed that would shape the monarchy's future. The debate over Prince Harry's titles had now reached its peak. The palace had avoided drastic measures for years, hoping time and distance would settle the matter naturally. But the moment at the Invictus Games had reignited a fire that could no longer be ignored. Behind closed doors, advisors presented King Charles with two clear options. The first was to do nothing, to allow Harry's status to remain as it was. He was no longer a working royal, no longer representing the crown, but he still carried his Duke of Sussex title. This approach would maintain the fragile balance that had existed since he left the royal fold. An unspoken understanding that while Harry had stepped back, he was not fully removed. The second option was to formally strip him of his titles, a move that would sever the last remaining institutional ties between him and the monarchy. It would be a decisive act, one that would send a clear message, not just to Harry, but to the world, that his time as a recognized member of the royal family was over. The consequences of such a decision weighed heavily on Charles. As a father, he had always held hope that time would heal the wounds between him and his son. He had not agreed with every choice Harry had made, but he had also never stopped loving him. To publicly strip him of his title would be a permanent move, one that might erase any chance of reconciliation. But as a king, his duty was to the monarchy. The royal family could not afford to have an undefined member lingering on the edges, half in and half out. It created confusion, invited controversy, and risked weakening the institution itself. For Charles, the choice was not just about Harry, it was about the monarchy's future. Meanwhile, in Montecito, Harry was also facing a reckoning of his own. He had spent the past few years living between two identities, one as a private citizen, building a life with Meghan and their children, and another as the prince who had walked away but never fully let go. The viral moment had forced him to confront something he had long avoided. Could he truly have it both ways? His relationship with the royal family had never been more fragile. The rare, brief moments of communication between him and his father were carefully managed. His bond with Prince William, once inseparable, was now nearly non-existent. Every public appearance, every interview, every word he spoke was analyzed for signs of whether reconciliation was possible, or whether the divide was now too deep. And now, with the palace considering a formal removal of his title, the moment of decision had arrived. His advisors continued to weigh the pros and cons. If he chose to fight for his title, it would mean acknowledging that he still valued that part of his identity. It would also mean opening another battle with the palace, one that could permanently cement his reputation as an adversary to the monarchy. If he chose to relinquish it willingly, he would gain the freedom he had always claimed to want. But at what cost? Without his royal title, would he still command the same influence? Would the world still see him as the powerful figure he had worked to become? The dilemma was not just about titles. It was about identity, legacy, and the future he wanted to build. As the world watched and waited, One thing was becoming clear. The question that had been asked at the Invictus